Right now, an unprecedented legal paradox is quietly unfolding at the highest levels of the United States government, and it involves a staggering conflict of interest that most legal scholars thought was practically impossible. A sitting president is actively involved in a lawsuit against the Department of Justice. Citizens sue the government all the time, but this situation is entirely different. The plaintiff suing the government is the president acting as a private citizen, and the defendant defending the government is the Justice Department, which is now completely controlled by the president and his newly appointed Attorney General, Todd Blanche. The president is essentially situated on both sides of the exact same massive legal dispute. The plaintiff and the defendant ultimately answer to the exact same executive authority, and they are currently moving toward a resolution that involves a so-called anti-weaponization fund and the transfer of nearly 1.8 million in financial resources. This is a settlement that directly benefits the president and his immediate family, and it potentially opens the door for individuals who violently stormed the Capitol on January the 6th to gain access to these resources. This is not a hypothetical law school exercise. This is happening right now in our federal court system. And it raises a fundamental question about the absolute foundation of our legal system. When the head of the executive branch utilizes the Justice Department to settle a lawsuit that he initiated as a private citizen who is actually looking out for the American taxpayer, who is representing the public interest when the scales of justice are being calibrated by the specific person who stands to benefit the most. To comprehend exactly how we arrived at this moment and what it means for the future of equal justice under the law, we have to look inside the Department of Justice. We need to examine the confirmation of Todd Blanche, the alarming written assurances that have been accepted by the Senate, and a looming deadline regarding the explosive Jeffrey Epstein files that could easily force a constitutional crisis by this Thursday. The mechanics of this situation are undeniably complex, but the underlying reality is actually very simple. We are currently witnessing a severe test of the institutional guardrails that are specifically designed to keep federal law enforcement completely independent from personal and political motives. To grasp the severity of this development, you do not have to rely on partisan critics or political adversaries. You can listen directly to the individuals who have actually run the Justice Department from the inside. Alberto Gonzales is a prominent conservative legal figure. He served as White House counsel and subsequently as the Attorney General of the United States under President George W. Bush. He navigated the Justice Department through a highly tumultuous historical era. He intimately understands the immense tension that exists between serving a president's political agenda and upholding the blind administration of justice. And when he evaluates what is happening right now under the leadership of Todd Blanche, he is deeply concerned. Gonzales has publicly questioned the fundamental legitimacy of a settlement where the president is essentially negotiating with his own Justice Department. He explicitly characterizes the arrangement as highly questionable and points out the obvious reality. A financial arrangement of this magnitude that enriches the president while he controls the levers of the defense is a profound and undeniable conflict of interest. If you appreciate independent investigations that consistently follow the verifiable facts wherever they lead, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing these critical stories to light. Let us break down exactly how this anti-weaponization fund settlement is structured and why it has profoundly alarmed so many veteran federal prosecutors. In a normal civil lawsuit involving the federal government, the Department of Justice acts as a formidable shield for the general public. Its primary mandate is to vigorously defend federal agencies, carefully protect the national treasury, and ensure that taxpayer money is never distributed without immense legal justification. Career attorneys spend decades fighting aggressively to limit the government's financial liability. But in this particular instance, that traditional adversarial process has completely collapsed. The plaintiff is pushing aggressively for a lucrative settlement, and the defendant, led by Attorney General Todd Blanche, is fundamentally aligned with the plaintiff. Blanche recently committed to rescinding this so-called anti-weaponization fund, a controversial maneuver that is expected to facilitate the handover of significant designated resources, and the institutional implications extend far beyond the president himself. There are legitimate, documented concerns that this specific fund has been systematically targeted by the Justice Department in a manner that could eventually provide financial access or direct relief to the specific rioters who aggressively attacked the Capitol building on January the 6th. Consider the monumental institutional consequence of that specific decision. Individuals who were aggressively prosecuted under the rule of law for attempting to forcefully disrupt the peaceful transfer of presidential power might somehow benefit from a financial restructuring executed inside the very federal department that prosecuted them. Former Attorney General Gonzalez calls this disturbing prospect completely abhorrent. He notes that it runs entirely contrary to the fundamental rule of law. We should all be critically asking how a legal system can possibly maintain its credibility when the individuals who violently attack the seat of constitutional government are financially accommodated by the specific agency responsible for holding them legally accountable. Some members of the United States Senate ultimately caved during the contentious confirmation process. They inexplicably accepted written assurances from Todd Blanche regarding exactly how he would handle these blatant and unprecedented conflicts of interest. They felt satisfied enough to push his nomination through the chamber, even though 49 senators went on the official congressional record explicitly stating that Blanche is entirely unfit and completely unqualified to serve as the Attorney General given his questionable past history. But written assurances are ultimately only as strong as the personal integrity of the individual who signs them. And as Gonzalez astutely pointed out during his recent analysis, a very smart and motivated group of attorneys will always attempt to discover a creative legal mechanism to bypass those written promises in order to deliver exactly what the president demands. If the federal judicial system does not proactively step in to prevent this questionable settlement from moving forward, the destructive precedent it establishes will permanently alter how the Justice Department operates for generations. Here is where the investigation gets significantly more complicated and where the immediate consequences become incredibly high. The Department of Justice is not exclusively dealing with lucrative civil lawsuits and controversial financial settlements. It is currently sitting on one of the most highly anticipated, fiercely debated, and heavily guarded collections of sensitive documents in modern American history. The Justice Department possesses the comprehensive Jeffrey Epstein files. For multiple years, countless victims, investigative journalists, and the general public have rightfully demanded absolute transparency regarding Jeffrey Epstein's vast international network of wealthy enablers, influential associates, and protected co-conspirators. The persistent institutional secrecy surrounding these explosive files has consistently fueled endless speculation, massive public distrust in our foundational institutions, and profound ongoing psychological trauma for the countless victims who were brutally trafficked and abused. But this situation is no longer simply a matter of mounting public pressure. The United States Congress actually passed binding legislation explicitly requiring the comprehensive release of the Jeffrey Epstein files. It is an unambiguous statutory mandate. The Department of Justice possesses a strict legal obligation to release these specific documents to the American public, and they are facing intense judicial scrutiny regarding this exact mandate in federal court this coming Thursday. Attorney General Todd Blanche now holds the ultimate executive authority over those highly classified files. As the confirmed Attorney General, he possesses the unquestionable legal power to authorize their immediate public release. During his preceding tenure as Deputy Attorney General and Acting Attorney General, he inexplicably failed to execute this mandate. But right now, he has officially taken a binding oath of federal office. He has solemnly sworn to faithfully execute the established laws of the United States, and the law unambiguously requires absolute transparency in this specific criminal matter. According to the direct legal assessment provided by Alberto Gonzalez, there is literally only one individual in the entire country who possesses the executive authority to actively stop Todd Blanche from releasing those explosive files, and that individual is the President of the United States. If Thursday arrives and the controversial documents are ultimately withheld from the public domain, the American populace will possess a completely legitimate right to forcefully ask exactly why the President is actively intervening to protect the destructive secrets of Jeffrey Epstein's criminal network. And if the president actually issues that unprecedented executive order, Todd Blanche will immediately face the defining ethical test of his entire professional career. What exactly does an attorney general do when the president directly orders him to deliberately ignore a binding transparency law passed by the United States Congress? The constitutional answer should be abundantly clear. As Gonzalez explained directly and without hesitation, if the president aggressively halts the required release, the attorney general must look him directly in the eye and state unequivocally that he possesses an overriding obligation under his sworn oath of office. He must clearly articulate that Congress legally passed the transparency mandate, and he must faithfully follow it. And if the president stubbornly refuses to rescind the unlawful directive, the attorney general possesses only one acceptable ethical alternative. he must immediately resign from his position. If Todd Blanche decides to remain securely in federal office while actively concealing the Jeffrey Epstein files in deliberate defiance of a clear congressional mandate, he will be operating in direct and undeniable violation of his sworn oath. That specific oath is profoundly important because it is not sworn to a particular political party. It is not sworn to the personal interests of the President of the United States. It is exclusively sworn to the United States Constitution and to the established laws of the sovereign country. This coming Thursday, we will collectively witness exactly what kind of internal courage Todd Blanche actually possesses. We will definitively discover if he is genuinely willing to risk his prestigious cabinet position to deliver long overdue justice for the traumatized victims of Jeffrey Epstein, or if he will tragically allow the Department of Justice to be utilized as a protective institutional shield for the powerful, the connected, and the deeply privileged. The inherent constitutional tension between faithfully serving the president's priorities and independently serving the absolute rule of law represents the central philosophical conflict of the Justice Department. Every single attorney general must navigate this precarious ethical tightrope. The president is democratically elected by the voting public to pursue specific law enforcement priorities, and the attorney general undeniably functions as a vital component of the president's executive cabinet. But unlike the Secretary of Transportation or the Secretary of Agriculture, the attorney general possesses a highly distinct, profoundly independent constitutional responsibility. The Department of Justice must aggressively investigate and actively prosecute suspected wrongdoing without displaying any trace of political favoritism or personal allegiance. There was a highly revealing, arguably devastating moment during Todd Blanche's contentious confirmation hearings before the Congressional Committee. It was a fleeting moment that numerous political observers witnessed in real time, and it perfectly encapsulated exactly why so many veteran legal experts are desperately sounding the institutional alarm. While answering rigorous questions from the assembled lawmakers, Blanche actually misspoke and instinctively referred to himself as the president's lawyer. He quickly attempted to correct the glaring verbal error, desperately stating that he would serve as the lawyer leading the Department of Justice. But that specific psychological slip of the tongue was incredibly illustrative and deeply troubling. It inadvertently revealed a fundamentally compromised institutional mindset. The president already retains numerous private defense attorneys to aggressively protect his personal financial interests. The Attorney General is specifically designated as the lawyer representing the United States of America. When the individual nominated to lead the premier federal law enforcement agency instinctively perceives himself as the president's dedicated personal attorney, the entire foundational architecture of independent, unbiased law enforcement begins to visibly fracture and potentially collapse. Until definitively proven otherwise, we must cautiously wait and observe whether Blanche will faithfully execute the complex laws of this massive country. Gonzalez has publicly stated that he respectfully wishes to grant Blanche the initial benefit of the doubt, desperately hoping that the immense crushing weight of American history will eventually fall upon his shoulders and force him to deeply comprehend his ultimate constitutional responsibility. But Gonzalez also candidly admitted that he would be incredibly naive and demonstrably foolish not to accurately remember the turbulent history of the past several years. We are obligated to critically examine the questionable decisions that have already been executed, the concerning administrative performance we have already directly witnessed, and the undeniable reality of exactly how this particular administration inherently views the expansive concept of absolute executive power. And this critical realization immediately brings us to another deeply concerning, recently documented development that strikes directly at the vulnerable heart of our democratic electoral process. The Department of Justice is not exclusively handling lucrative financial settlements and classifying highly sensitive evidentiary files. It plays a fundamentally critical, legally mandated role in vigorously enforcing civil rights and actively monitoring our national elections. Right now, the president is proactively casting massive, unsubstantiated doubt on the foundational integrity of the electoral process. He has baselessly claimed that there is widespread, outcome-altering fraud occurring in several specific states, conspicuously targeting the populous states of California and Michigan. And in direct response to these entirely baseless public claims, the administration is aggressively dispatching Department of Justice federal monitors to numerous polling sites scattered around the country. This alarming deployment is definitively not a minor bureaucratic detail. Deploying federal law enforcement monitors to local community voting precincts constitutes a highly sensitive, historically fraught executive action. When this specific mechanism is utilized exclusively to protect fundamental voting rights and ensure equitable access to the democratic ballot, it functions as a genuinely vital, necessary function of the federal government. But when this identical deployment is aggressively driven by a highly partisan president who is loudly, repeatedly, and falsely proclaiming that the entire electoral system is systematically rigged against him, the deployment assumes an entirely different, substantially more menacing character. It objectively looks like the deliberate weaponization of federal executive power designed to deliberately intimidate local election officials, to artificially manufacture a nationwide climate of deep public suspicion, and to strategically fabricate the deceptive appearance of widespread electoral fraud where absolutely none legitimately exists. Should the American voting populace be genuinely worried that the historically independent Justice Department is being cynically utilized for blatantly partisan political purposes specifically intended to artificially impact legitimate election results? The empirical answer, based on the documented evidence, is unequivocally yes. Every single informed citizen should be profoundly alarmed when the immense, unparalleled coercive power of the federal Justice Department is unapologetically deployed to actively serve a transparent political campaign strategy. We have undeniably traveled down this exact destructive path before in recent American history. Immediately following the conclusion of the previous presidential election cycle, the president vehemently articulated identical, unsubstantiated claims regarding massive voter fraud and coordinated election interference. Those explosive public claims were investigated exhaustively by numerous independent agencies, and they were completely, comprehensively debunked by the available empirical evidence. We absolutely do not have to blindly guess about the verified facts surrounding the security of the previous presidential election. The president's very own highly loyal former Attorney General, William Barr, stated clearly and unequivocally on the public record that the inflammatory claims alleging outcome determinative systemic fraud were demonstrably false. Furthermore, Chris Krebs, the respected professional who served as the designated head of federal cybersecurity for the entire nation during that highly scrutinized election, emphatically confirmed that it constituted the most technically secure democratic election in the entire history of the United States. The aggressive allegations insisting upon massive coordinated interference was simply not rooted in objective reality. And yet, despite that undeniable factual record, the exact same deceptive political playbook is being aggressively utilized right now, accompanied by the unprecedented added institutional threat of armed Justice Department monitors being strategically dispatched to specific states that the president happens to personally dislike for purely political reasons. We must consequently remain highly vigilant and incredibly alert for any unsubstantiated suggestion or manufactured suspicion regarding phantom election interference, particularly when those deceptive calls are forcefully originating directly from inside the highest echelons of the federal government itself. Our decentralized election systems are certainly not entirely perfect simply because they are ultimately administered by fallible human beings, but they remain highly localized, exceptionally transparent, and incredibly resilient against systemic manipulation. They are, as numerous nonpartisan cybersecurity experts have repeatedly noted, phenomenally robust and remarkably effective. We should maintain absolute confidence that the upcoming national elections will be conducted in a strictly lawful, entirely legal manner. But preserving that essential public confidence requires us to forcefully and consistently push back against any calculated, cynical attempt to deliberately weaponize the immense authority of the Justice Department in order to improperly disrupt the democratic process. Up to this current juncture, the official narrative relentlessly promoted by the executive administration might superficially sound like standard, acceptable political maneuvering. They routinely claim they are merely seeking to efficiently settle an incredibly old, burdensome lawsuit, temporarily withholding highly sensitive evidentiary files for necessary careful legal review, and benevolently monitoring local elections strictly to ensure administrative fairness. But when you meticulously analyze the verified documented timeline of recent events, when you clearly identify the glaring contradictions embedded within their carefully crafted public statements, and when you objectively examine exactly who actually benefits from these unprecedented executive decisions, the official polished explanation completely disintegrates upon closer inspection. The highly controversial settlement regarding the so-called anti-weaponization fund is demonstrably not about responsibly saving crucial taxpayer money. It is quite clearly about deliberately transferring immense financial wealth directly to the president while simultaneously potentially shielding violent domestic rioters from ongoing legal accountability. The continued inexplicable delay in immediately releasing the explosive Jeffrey Epstein files is objectively not about conducting a careful, measured legal review. It is unmistakably about aggressively protecting an extensive network of powerful, highly connected individuals in absolute defiance of a binding transparency law legally passed by the United States Congress. And the strategic deployment of federal election monitors to specific jurisdictions like California and Michigan is certainly not about benevolently securing the Democratic vote. It is transparently about methodically laying the necessary administrative groundwork to retroactively challenge legitimate election results that the current administration simply does not happen to politically prefer. These alarming developments are absolutely not isolated, disconnected incidents. They represent interconnected, highly visible symptoms characterizing a federal justice department that is rapidly, visibly losing its foundational institutional independence. When 49 sitting United States senators explicitly declare on the permanent congressional record that a nominated attorney general is fundamentally unfit to occupy the prestigious office, they are not merely engaging in standard, expected partisan bickering. They are carefully evaluating the specific past actions, the highly questionable specific legal history, and the incredibly glaring specific conflicts of interest that objectively define Todd Blanche's professional record. They are carefully looking at an individual who accidentally, yet revealingly, referred to himself out loud as the president's personal lawyer because, for all practical purposes and observable intents, that is exactly how he has consistently operated during his tenure. We are collectively watching the steady, systematic erosion of a truly fundamental American legal principle. The objective rule of law fundamentally only functions properly if the specific individuals holding immense political power are strictly subject to the exact same rigorous rules, regulations, and consequences as everyone else in society. If the sitting president can successfully sue the federal government and subsequently negotiate a massive, unprecedented financial payout directly with his very own handpicked executive appointee, the law objectively ceases to function as a protective shield for the general public. Instead, it tragically becomes a highly convenient, weaponized tool designed for explicit personal enrichment and political retribution. If the president can successfully order his designated attorney general to blatantly ignore a binding congressional statutory mandate regarding a massive, horrific international human trafficking ring, the delicate constitutional balance of power is effectively destroyed. The legislative branch of the government becomes entirely powerless, and the executive branch becomes dangerously, entirely unaccountable to the American people. This precise dynamic is exactly why the approaching immediate days are so fundamentally critical to the survival of our legal institutions. The impending Thursday judicial deadline regarding the highly anticipated Epstein files will inevitably force a massive, highly visible public confrontation. It will essentially force Todd Blanche to definitively choose between his perceived personal loyalty to the specific man who recently appointed him to power and his solemnly sworn constitutional oath to protect the established laws of the United States. If he ultimately decides to courageously release the classified files to the public, he will effectively prove that there genuinely remains a definitive ethical line that the Justice Department absolutely will not willingly cross. He will conclusively prove that he truly understands the profound, indispensable difference between operating as a highly paid personal defense lawyer and serving as the independent Attorney General of the United States of America. The countless traumatized victims of Jeffrey Epstein's horrific enterprise have waited far too incredibly long for basic justice, and they fundamentally deserve to finally know exactly who facilitated, funded, and protected that monstrous criminal operation for decades. But if Blanche ultimately capitulates to executive pressure, if he willfully allows the president to unlawfully block the required public release, he will definitively confirm the absolute worst, darkest fears expressed by his most vocal institutional critics. He will tragically prove, beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt, that the premier Department of Justice has been completely, irreparably captured by partisan executive interests. This entire situation is not merely a transient story about standard Washington politics. typical bureaucratic maneuvering or ordinary partisan disagreements. It is a profoundly serious investigation about lasting generational consequences. The unprecedented executive decisions being systematically executed right now inside the echoing halls of the Justice Department will directly, unavoidably affect the fundamental integrity of our democratic elections, the vital legal accountability of our highest elected leaders, and the foundational underlying fairness of our entire civil society. We absolutely cannot simply allow these deeply concerning executive actions to continue happening quietly in the comforting dark. We must vigorously demand absolute transparency. We must relentlessly question the polished official explanations provided by the administration, and we must consistently hold our incredibly powerful federal institutions strictly accountable to the verified, objective facts. If you firmly believe in the crucial importance of maintaining independent, rigorously evidence based investigations that effectively cut through the partisan noise and successfully hold immense executive power strictly to account, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel.